Hey everybody, welcome to another of our Your Best Game Ever videos. I'm Monte Cook of Monte Cook Games, and with me today is Darcy Ross, also of Monte Cook Games. And we are here because of this book, which is now available. And this book is intended to just help you out in every aspect of your role-playing games, from the stuff that you've seen before, like how to create a cool character, to stuff that I don't think you've ever seen before, like the best ways to host a game and whatnot. But today's topic is GMing. And so we thought we'd start with the basics, right? I know that a lot of people are interested in maybe running a game and seeing what that's like, but they're hesitant because it feels like there's a lot of responsibility, a lot of pressure. So let's talk about that. And actually, Darcy, I know that you are now a hardcore lover of all things game mastering.
I am.
But there was a time when you kind of fell into the category that I was just talking about, right?
Absolutely. It seemed really intimidating at first. Why would I want to take on all that responsibility and to have to know the rules and, running everything, and where do they even get their ideas? It just seemed like this really mysterious process that I could never tackle at first. But what sort of turned the tide for me was like necessity. I actually discovered, I was getting a taste of all these new games. I'd gone to Gen Con. I was like, oh my gosh, so many games to try. But I absolutely fell in love with Numenera, and so Tattoo.
Yay!
Yeah, I mean, the world, and I was a scientist, and the setting just felt like, that Goldilocks zone for me. And I was like, I have to play more of this. And you know what doesn't seem reasonable? Like handing a friend a big book and saying, run this for me. I think some people would do it. I think maybe if I had tried, it could have worked, but don't do that. Just run it yourself. It's so fun. So I learned how to do it, and I read the book, and I my hands shook the entire first session, and it went fine. And I've been like just ravenous for GMing ever since, and almost like I just can't get enough of it. So you could be like me, come GM.
So I sometimes say that running a game is like being sort of part storyteller, part manager, because you're managing a lot of information and people, right? And you're also a referee, kind of, right?
Yeah.
Because you're the one sort of adjudicating things and deciding, yes, that works, no, that doesn't work, that kind of thing. So really, like, if we want to boil things really, really down and get to the very basics of running games, or even just role-playing games in general, right? Role-playing games are a conversation.
Right.
They're a conversation mostly between the game master and the players. And so I think a big key to good game mastering, or just game mastering period, is conveying information, how you convey the information, because you have to remember that the players can't know anything about the world unless it comes from you, right? You are their conduit into the imaginary world that everyone is playing in. And so, you're their eyes, you tell them what they see, you're their ears, what they hear, et cetera, et cetera. And, the more of a picture that you can paint, the better sort of grounding that they'll have. And if you give them things to key off of, right? Like, oh, you go into this cellar and, there's a weird dark corner and you maybe see something moving, right? You're drawing their attention to that dark corner and they're going to go investigate it. And so in a way, the players are in control of their actions, of the character's actions, but you're the director with the camera and you're pointing, right?
And how you describe that will change how they interpret it, right? We talked a little bit about this in our world building episode, where through the GM is a major, the words that you use as a GM as you're painting the sensory experience they have. That's a lot of the ways that the world building you might have done in your head, or the setting that you might be using, comes to life in this conversation between all of the players, right? So it's really important. And I think when I first started GMing, I didn't know what details I should be giving out at first, right? Because, you read books and you can read long pages of like describing every food item that people are eating, and, the details on the hems of dresses and stuff. And for some games, those kind of details are actually really cool and totally work. But if you've forgotten to describe, like, what room are we in? Like, where am I? Sometimes my players would ask me like, wait, where are we? And I was like, oh yeah, I have a perfect mental image. But I have not communicated that to you yet, that you're in like a square room about 30 feet, on a side. So learning some of those like spatial details versus the sensory details. But like you said, I think, there's the logistics side, but there's also like going down your sensory checklist helps really bring that setting to life.
I think so too, right? Sometimes, talking about a weird smell is way more evocative than some weird sight or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, if we're gonna continue this idea that a role-playing game is really a conversation,
mm-hmm.
like you were just mentioning, the players ask, well, wait, where are we? Maybe not that question. That's
right.
that kind of indicates that you have not filled in a gap that you should have. But
right.
but even then, right? Like you haven't done anything wrong when the players
mm-hmm.
ask you questions, right? Because it means they want more information.
Yeah.
Right. And that's great. And so I sort of feel like the conversation that is going on here is almost all questions and answers,
mm-hmm.
right? So the player says, well, what do I see when I go over to that dark corner in the cellar?
Mm-hmm.
I say, well, you see what looks like 3 dead rats that have just recently been, horribly half-eaten. And so what do you do, right? And then they tell me what they do, right? And then they ask a question about, well, what happens when I, examine these, dead rats or whatever.
Yeah.
It's just a back and forth of question and answer.
Right.
And Darcy, like, you're really good. I've had the good fortune of having you be my game master. You're really good at a different kind of GM question. And this is almost getting into advanced game mastering, but I want to talk about it here because we're talking about answers and questions.
Right.
So Darcy, tell us about what one of your favorite GMing things to do as far as questions go.
It's my favorite toy in the GM toolbox, I think. I love it for so many reasons, but it emerged out of, oh God, what is in that dark corner? Oh no, I haven't planned for that. And so a lot of times, you're so right that it's how we pass information, and the conversation is by asking a question. And so if they say, well, I go over to the corner, what do I see? And I go, oh, what do you see? And, and I basically turn a lot of questions onto the players. And so I might also ask things like, okay, you're in this really cool ball, and you're all up in your fancy like gowns and things. You've just entered, like, this character, like, tell me what your character sees or is experiencing, or how do they feel about that thing? So I love asking kind of questions of the players, whether it's about their own character or even about details of the setting itself. I love giving them a little light that they get to illuminate part of my world with.
Yeah, like one thing that you can do that isn't advanced GMing, right, is, like, let's say you're in a fantasy game and the bad evil wizard casts a fear spell on somebody's character, and they fail their saving throw or their resistance, and the game mechanics just say, okay, you're terrified and you have to run away. But that's a great moment to ask them, what's going on in your mind? What is the fear that is, what is your character's big fear that you are suddenly experiencing? And that's a moment where they get to, like you said, they get the spotlight, they get to shine it on their character, but it's also a learning opportunity for them, probably, right? Because they probably haven't thought about what their character's biggest fear is,
Yeah.
right? Until that very moment, right?
Yeah.
And it's also interesting, you know, for everyone else to hear that and become sort of participants in some way in that exchange.
Yeah, it really brings it to life more than like, and the fact that like two people have collaborated on it feels really good, I think, right? Like, oh, you know, I've introduced maybe that there's a fear spell on you, but you've introduced that, you know, what that means, and it just starts to feel more layered, just like sort of our world building sensory, right? You're getting a little more detail that makes a thing feel more alive than rote.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you don't want to go too far down this road,
Right.
I think, right? You can kind of bog things down, but you know, if the players go into a bar and you know they're meeting an NPC in this bar,
Mm-hmm.
ask them what their favorite drink is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly they're doing character development right there in front of you, and that's really interesting, I think. So I've written a lot of articles and books and things on running games, and if you're familiar with any of them, you probably won't be surprised to learn that I think that the most important thing about being a GM is pacing and timing. And it is the difference between a game that drags and is boring or goes so fast that no one knows what's going on, and you know, a really fun game. You would be surprised at the difference. Like two GMs can run the exact same adventure, but if one understands pacing better than the other, their group is going to have a much more fun time. And so I think, you know, you first have to think about the pacing within an encounter, right? So the players have just, you know, encountered a bunch of ogres or whatever, right? And they're going to fight them. And, you know, I think you want everyone to feel like they're contributing, but you still want to keep things moving at a nice, brisk pace, right?
Right.
You know, it's something that fiction writers learn very early on, that if you're writing something that's actiony and filled with lots of quick movements and stuff, you write very quickly and you use short sentences and whatnot, because that conveys what's going on. And you can do the same thing in a role-playing game, right? Where and like sometimes you can even kind of convey a mood just by the way you're talking to the players, right? So if you're just like, what do you do? Right? There's suddenly a sense of urgency and kind of pressure, not in a bad way, right? But like, oh, I better figure out what to do with these ogres, right? And I think that's pretty interesting, and you can keep things moving along. But you know, if it's a completely different kind of encounter, right, where you're sitting around the campfire talking to some, you know, the other PCs and maybe a couple of NPCs or whatever, you know, kick back, tell some stories, you know,
talk about how the moon looks, you know. Give it a longer sentence and like sort of linger in it. You know, those longer sentences can encourage everybody else to, you know, speak a little more at length, and versus, what do you do? I raise my sword. You know, people will try to match that sort of unconsciously.
I think you're absolutely right. It's sort of like if you've ever been around someone who like speaks with an accent, and suddenly like, other people start falling into that accent, and it's kind of interesting. But you know, it's the same kind of thing, right? We pick up these cues from other people, and really, you know, if you just remember that whole thing, that it's just a conversation between everyone at the table, the same rules kind of apply, right? And so the most difficult part of pacing, I think, is actually pacing within a session. I think that and so what a new GM, like a trap that a new GM might fall into, is giving everything within a session sort of the same pacing,
equal weight.
And you know, sort of play out every single moment of the characters' lives, and you know, okay, so you walk to the store and it takes, you know, 20 minutes, and you know, who cares, right? I mean,
sometimes I'll be saying stuff like that and I'm like, why am I talking? Why am I still here? Sometimes you'll learn to notice, oh, this is not what I should be giving my time to or my words to, right? I've
right.
noticed that a lot. That's how I can tell when I'm wrong.
Right. There's a funny fact that I always think about in this regard, and that is when motion pictures first started, when they were brand new, right? Silent, black and white movie, right? They had, like, if in your story someone drove to the store, right? You had to show them walk out of their house, get in the car, drive down the road, stop, get out of their car, walk to the store.
Ooh.
And if you didn't, if you just cut to the store, like, no one would have any idea what was going on because we hadn't learned that visual language of movies.
Yeah.
But now, today, with modern audiences, you can just cut, and we can follow the narrative. Think about that when you're running games, right? You can just cut to the store, right?
Yeah.
It's because it's all conversation, right? It takes just as much time to say, okay, so 15 minutes later, as it takes to say, okay, the following month, this happened, right? I mean, time doesn't make any difference, right? When it comes, it's just words that you're using at the table.
That's such a good point. So when I'm pacing through a session, I think I find it the hardest piece of pacing because often, that's when my plans meet the players. And so like I go in, thinking, oh, here's some like beats I want to hit. Here's some stuff I expect to happen. But because it's a conversation, they're going to introduce these elements I didn't expect. And so it's the piece of pacing that to me feels the most like reactive, right? Someone wants to go do a thing I just totally hadn't planned for. And so we're in a new location and I'm sort of going on autopilot instead of thinking about pacing, right?
Right.
So I think one thing that helps me when I'm within a session is I'm often kind of like looking for the ending a little bit, right? I'm sort of keeping an eye on, it's always nice to sort of end at a good stopping point. And so I'm sort of in the back of my head thinking about, ooh, are we investigating this mystery? Well, wouldn't it be cool if we got to like a twist somewhere in this mystery by the end, right? Thinking about some of those, what I'm aiming for a little bit helps me. And then the other thing is, I think one of the questions that I try to ask myself while I'm GMing is like, what is this serving? And one answer could be, it's really fun and everyone's having a blast. And so like, continue. If I'm trying to like, get people to a clue, right? There's a clue they need to find here. And I'm trying to like maneuver us so that the clue gets revealed. Sometimes if you're trying to walk them from their car into the door and they meet some NPCs, but the secret is back in the back room and you've got to get them there, right? That might be a good time to have a directorial, cut as you search the place. An hour passes and finally you find the clue rather than walking them through every little kind of meaningless bit of set dressing to get to the clue. Do you have any tips? Yeah.
I think that's brilliant. When I'm a player and, we've got to search this big area because there's, something hidden or whatever. And it's like, okay, well, I search the west wall. Okay, I go look under the table or whatever.
Yeah.
Sometimes I start to kind of roll my eyes. And when the GM just says, okay, after, like you just said, right, after an hour of searching, you find this, I'm so grateful. The only time that I think that isn't right is when there's something particularly interesting and the player player focuses on it, right? Like there's a statue in the room and right, and so I go over and is the statue facing something interesting and that kind of thing. Then all of a sudden, slow things down because that could be interesting, and it's interesting because they
asked,
right?
Totally.
And I want to key off of that too, because you kind of suggested that as well. Like, I think the key to pacing within a session is to pay attention to the players and see what they want to do, see what they like, what they're zeroing in on.
Yeah.
see what they're having fun with, right? And so like, you can do a whole thing, you can do a whole encounter where it's, okay, well, we're going to go to the marketplace and we're going to, buy some supplies and whatnot before we go off on this big adventure. And, as a GM, realize that within your toolbox, you can say, okay, you buy all the stuff that you need and now you're on the road. Yeah. Or you can go to the complete other extreme and you can describe the merchant and the beautiful wares that they're selling, right? And let the players kind of dictate, it, like if they're really interested, then great, make that a whole thing. That might turn into the whole session, right?
Totally.
And, right? But if you're, making up cool NPCs and the market is cool and tries to pick their pocket or whatever, right? It's worth a whole session.
Yeah. That's such a good point.
Just, okay, that'll be 3 gold pieces. Okay, here's 3, right? That's not fun.
Right.
So just look up the prices in the book and let's go.
Yep. And that's such a good point. Like the players will tell you, right?
Yeah.
You might if you're interested in making that kind of a fun experience, maybe you give the NPC an interesting quirk. We'll talk about NPCs in a minute. And if the players start engaging, if they start sniffing around and kind of wanting to know more, then you build it up. And if they don't, then you move on.
And you don't have to do it the same every time, right? The market can be a huge encounter one session, and then they go back to the market and just they get their stuff, right?
Mm-hmm. What about sessions add up to campaigns, right? And when we compare pacing within a campaign to a session, I find campaigns a tiny bit easier just because I have time in between sessions to sort of think about, okay, last session was so high energy, right? I can see that people have some stuff they want to explore. Maybe this one's a little, has more breathing room where, people can direct it a little more. I can ask maybe, you have a day, does anyone want to do anything interesting? And we can kind of vignette through it. I can kind of contrast with the pacing of prior sessions and give people something new or more of what I think they need. But how do you think about pacing within a campaign?
The perfect campaign, and no one ever achieves this, right? But the perfect campaign is set up like one of those television shows like The X-Files or Veronica Mars or something, where every single episode, or in this case session, right, sort of has a nice beginning, middle, and end, but there's also this much longer arc that ties everything together, and so it feels like a number of small stories within a large story. That's the way I like to think of campaigns. It doesn't always work, right? It sometimes, a story turns out to be 3 sessions, not all in one session. Sometimes you have 2 stories in a session, and it doesn't really matter. I think as long as by the end of the campaign, if everyone has sort of done their thing, right? They've the woman who's looking for her lost brother, and that she wrote that into her backstory. Let's find the brother by the end of the day, right? The guy who wanted to kill the Dark Lord. There's the big finale with the Dark Lord at the end, right? And I think that in that way, much like you were saying before, right, you're paying attention to the players,
right?
And you just kind of keep in mind, and one of the things that you're going to see if you take a look at your best game ever is pretty much the solution to every problem is just talk about it, right? And so this is one of those things where you just talk about it with the players and find out what they want, right? Are you still having fun? Should we keep this campaign going, or should we wind things down and start something different?
Oh yeah.
And I think that you can end a campaign and have a big epic finale or whatever, or you can just have it kind of go.
Yeah. I found it so valuable. The first time I ever ran a campaign, I was co-running it. So I had a co-GM. We were both new to it. We were very intimidated. And so we would sort of bounce ideas back and forth. And, but I was so grateful that, like, we checked in about, a couple sessions in with the players. Okay, so, we felt this out. We have a sense of the system, our characters. We kind of know what we're doing here. How much longer are we all interested in playing? And it turns out some people were moving, right? And so we had a kind of a hard deadline, and that worked great for me because, it was like, okay, I know what we've established. I know what has happened in the little episodes and what hints I have dropped about a bigger overarching story. And now I see the end, right? And so now I get to have fun getting us there. And so I think talking to the players really helped. And then like the players kind of have get to have some of the fun of, we're getting near the end, like, ooh boy, that's exciting. So I would definitely encourage people not to be afraid of having sort of tighter campaigns. I certainly lean that way.
So what do you do? Like you were mentioning before, that like, if you're running a mystery session, mystery adventure, and there's a cool twist to the mystery and you really want that to come at the end of the session, and you know that you're going to play until 10 o'clock that night.
Yeah.
It's 8:30 and they're almost at that point where they're going to encounter the twist. What do you do?
I'm really curious to see what your answer is, but what I would probably do is, I would end it, right? I would end it early, end them on a surprise. But then what I like to do is, kind of like development mode for Invisible Sun. There's all kinds of cool stories that when you're like on the track to like get through the campaign and you're pursuing like the big story that you don't have time to get to, but when you've made progress on the campaign, you have a breath. We can get to like, let's explore your backstory. Like, hey, let's have a little scene, and just sort of I've just free-formed role played it or talked about it before. Or we have like, you can play with time, you can play with all sorts of things. So I kind of like, I would end it and then have some opportunity to do a little character exploration or have scenes or vignettes of something that deepens the characters or the story for us. That's what I would do.
Cool.
What would you do?
Well, I mean, so what we're really talking about here is, understanding what good pacing is all well and good, but how do you achieve it, right?
Yeah.
How do you get the players
right
to be at the point you want them to be at a certain time in the session, in the campaign, or whatever? And again, the GM is the eyes and ears of the players, and so there are lots of things you can do to slow players down. If they're moving too fast, you can introduce some new NPC that just comes onto the scene and somehow complicates things, right?
The ravaged bear has a mate. I've pulled that one more times than I can count. Especially if you're really liking the combat, to drag it out more, give them more of that.
There's an old writing rule for like pulps and detective stories that, like, if you don't know what to do, have a guy with a gun come into the room, right? And that works great, but it could also be some other kind of complication. It could be some long lost friend and they've got information or whatever, right? And players will just pick up on these cues, right? And they will, if you have that happen, they won't ignore them and go finish the thing, right? They'll take the bait, so to speak, right? And if the players are going too slow, kind of go back to what we were saying before, like if they're just methodically searching everything they come upon, you can just say, okay, so you reached the throne room, right? And just fast, think of it as like, you're watching something and you can fast forward it or, slow it down at half speed or whatever. You really have a lot of control in that by sort of extraneous elements that you interject or that you take out. Right?
I also think like, so have you ever experienced it where one player is really wanting one pace and everybody else is wanting a different pace? There's someone who's like, just, really about this place or wants to talk to every person here or is really excited about a particular aspect, or wants to explore every corner, or there's all sorts of situations that I've been in, and you want to cut, maybe you want to speed up to like get everyone else who's twiddling their thumbs a chance to get into some sort of new content that they can engage with. But you also don't want to like screw over that player who's, clearly having so much fun lingering in this moment. So one thing I like to do is that you don't have to, you can hard cut, but you can still you can still let them peer through that segment that you've sort of excised out, paint a little picture of like some cool stuff people did, or you found this, and there was this whole situation with a ravage bear crossing the stream, and like, you player, tell me how your awesome survival skills helped us cross it, right? There are ways to ask questions that let you quickly have a back and forth and paint a picture, sketch a picture maybe, and then get beyond it. So that's been my solution for sort of imbalanced preferences and how the pacing needs to go at a given moment.
I think that's absolutely right, right? You've got a guy who goes into town and he literally wants to talk to everybody. You can say, so after a number of delightful conversations in which everyone comes away with a great impression of this character, right? You finally learn this and move on to the next thing.
Right.
Again, that's a fantastic way to control the pacing. You're pulling things out, or you're putting them back in. But let's talk about NPCs.
Ooh.
Because that's really a big part of GMing, right? Because the players obviously all have a character, and the GM is everyone else, right? The good guys, the bad guys, the people on the sidelines, just everybody.
Yeah.
Do you have any, like, what's your go-to for, like, okay, I've got to make up some cool NPCs? What do you do?
So I tend to be pretty light on certain kinds of prep. But the one thing that I like never leave home without is like, even if I'm doing it last minute and just like jotting it on the side of my sheet of paper, is like a list of some names. Because that is the thing that when I'm trying to think of an NPC, it is just the hardest thing for me. And I know some people are not like that at all, but that is the one core element that I will just absolutely fall on my face if I don't have some quick go-to names. And like, often the act of writing a name or like selecting one will conjure some weird, for some reason, it will conjure some idea of who this person is. And so that usually it gives me a bare skeleton to sort of work with at first. And then the other thing is like, if I'm really harried, often like it's a name and it's a vague outline of like what they look like, and then I go, right. But when I'm doing it right, when I feel good about an NPC that I've sort of come up with either kind of quickly, often I think I'm designing toward the NPCs I didn't imagine beforehand. It really helps if I can think of like one adjective or some like inspirational element. And the best advice that someone gave me recently was that what they write down when they think up NPCs is like a physical characteristic, like hunched shoulders or like chin up. And I was like, whoa. And this was an improviser who said that simple act of reminding yourself to lift your chin is going to conjure all this other elements of portrayal. Are they now they're haughty, right? And maybe they've got a particular kind of fancy person voice. And so with that one physical characteristic, it conjures all of these great acting techniques that I don't actually have, but can kind of flow from it. So when you're low on acting skills like me, that has really helped. So a name and a physical characteristic gets me pretty far.
I think that both of those are brilliant. I think that the list of names is so brilliant that I don't even think it's optional.
Yeah.
If you have not run a game before and you're watching this and you come away with only one thing, it's that in a game session, the game master is going to have to come up with, on the spot, 3 to 5 names minimum.
Yeah.
And so prepare them ahead of time, right? And because here's what's going to happen. You can prepare all your NPCs and you can do all this stuff, but they're going to go talk to somebody that you weren't expecting. Like, oh, I want to go talk to the watchmaker. Okay.
Oh, you mean Rufus? Well, Rufus is
exactly, because you look at your list, right? And I remember being a young GM and being put in that spot and like, I don't know, his name's Joe, right? I had a lot of NPCs named Joe, right?
Oh my gosh.
So I think that's all really brilliant.
So in Your Best Game Ever, there's this is a book of advice, but also like literal tools that you can pick up and use. And so there are some charts of cool, I believe there are just straight up names, lists of cool names, and then some NPC quirks. That has been super helpful, right? Because, apparently all I could think of today was hunches shoulders and lifts chin. It was all that was coming to me. So clearly that does not come straight to my mind. So having those lists of quirks can be really useful. And they also like differentiate your NPCs when like everyone is either chin up or hunched. Like it can, there are several issues with that, right? So having some external inspiration is often really helpful for me.
I think absolutely. You are not a bad GM if you need some external source of inspiration, because we all sort of fall into the same mental ruts over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And so a list like you'll find in Your Best Game Ever, or, just like you literally have a comic book next to you while, and flip it open to a page and you see a character and that's the character, right? Whatever you like. Use. I think when thinking about NPCs, like it helps me to think about what kind of NPC this is, right? And it helps me if I'm thinking about it ahead of time, and it helps me at the table, right? And so there are NPCs that are ongoing, right? They're people that the players are going to interact with over and over again. Maybe they even, go on the adventure with the players. Right. They're just kind of always around. Obviously, this person needs more detail, right? Yeah. And you got to work a little bit of backstory, and you've got to, depending on what game you're using, right, have some fleshed out stats or whatever. And then there's recurring characters that they're going to show up, like they're going to go talk to the innkeeper, and that, they're going to come back to the innkeeper and maybe a couple of times, right? And then there's NPCs that are going to show up once and be done, right? And frankly, most of the time, unless you're talking about like the big bad, most of the time opponents of any kind, whether it's monsters or villains, whatever, they're going to show up once. The players are going to defeat them, and they're not going to see them again, right? Unless it's like that sneaky bad guy that always gets away or whatever.
Right.
And then, of course, there's just the extras, right? There's just people walking down the street or whatever that you almost can think of them as like they don't really exist until a player sort of focuses on them, and then suddenly they kind of come into being in a way, right? So you just say, okay, there's people on the street, but then they say, well, we have somebody on the street for directions to whatever. Then all of a sudden that becomes an NPC and not just sort of the misty cloud around them of people, right? So like, Darcy, have you ever had any great experiences like making, the kind of NPC that is going to really stick in the players' minds and kind of has that extra touch?
There was one that I think in my first campaign that like I think I learned a lot from, and it was an NPC that I expected to be totally one-off. I didn't even know if they would interact with them. I had a cool postcard with a rockin' fox lady on it in a cool robe, and it was just a really cool piece of art, and I was like, that is going to be in my campaign. I don't know what she is, but she's mysterious, and today we're going into a weird ancient ruin, and so, maybe she's down in that strange device hanging out. The player that went in and found her was like off by himself and kind of having weird visions. And so, so I think this is a situation where it would have helped if I'd known like what her purpose is. And her purpose initially had been to be cool, but I placed her in this really mysterious, interesting place in this situation where all the players had so many questions. But this one PC went off by himself, had this weird vision and encountered her, and then came back and like didn't tell any of the other PCs that, but all the players knew, right? And so everyone wanted to know about her, right? And so then I had to learn, like, you know, I think that introduced me to the process of, okay, an NPC that players are really hooked on, like, what do I need to know about that person to make, when I bring her back in, to make her seem really alive and interesting and like at all engage with the players in any way, shape, or form. So that helped me sort of sit down and be like, you know, okay, she probably wants a thing. You know, why did she encounter him? What does she want? And I think that's been like the most helpful question for these NPCs for me. And I don't always come up with it. And, you know, I think even a really simple answer to that question can help you portray an NPC in like a consistent way. So, you know, she wanted to, I think, like resurrect a body or something. And so she was sort of petitioning the PCs later on. And like that suggested to me personality traits where she's trying to maybe like wheedle information out of these PCs or manipulate them. So it helped me lay out some more details. And I didn't have her full backstory, but I also didn't need a full backstory. You know, I just needed enough to know what they were sort of responding to. So that was sort of my accidental discovery of, oh God, the PCs are obsessed with an NPC that I meant as a one-off. What do I do?
I think that there's actually two really good points, right? One is the brilliant thing that you said about figuring out what an NPC wants. I mean, that is the way to look at every single NPC, right? From the person that they stop and ask for directions, right? Because that person might just want to not be bothered and get rid of them fast, right? To your main villain antagonist, right? What do they want, right?
Yeah.
Probably not to just do dastardly deeds and you know, twiddle their mustache, right? They want something legit, right? They want control of the kingdom. They want lots of money. They want whatever. They have a motivating factor that isn't just be a bad guy. And so if you think about that for every single NPC, that's great. And I also think that the point you made about, you know, I'm glad you did, because I almost forgot to say it, right? That like sometimes you will plan an NPC and it will become something you didn't plan at all, right? Yeah. I had a cab driver in a Call of Cthulhu game that I don't know what possessed me to actually have him start up a conversation with the players who were in the back of his cab, but I gave him a funny voice.
Yeah.
The players liked him so much that he became like, they dragged him into the adventure and he became like basically one of the main characters in the whole campaign. It was just because they said he had some funny catchphrases. Catchphrases are a great, like, if you think about like what's one thing that this character says, right? Like, you know, if it's a dwarven warrior, he's got a particular battle cry, or you know, just whatever. That's also a really good way to like. It's kind of like the chin up or punch shoulder thing, right? You hang your hat on this one ideal, because remember, like, you can't, when you're portraying the people of the world, you can't make every single one of them a really fully fledged human being, right? Yeah. You just want to give the illusion that they are, right? The players are only going to remember one thing. Oh, that's the guy with the big nose. Oh, that's the guy, right? Yeah. And so just give them one thing, because that's all they're going to remember anyway.
You know, it's kind of verisimilitude too versus realism, which is something we've talked about in world building. Right. With certain kinds of traits or a catchphrase, you know, a way you hold your body, that character will feel real, and it won't feel any less real than something that you maybe spent, you know, a lot of pages on, right? To the players, it often just feels exactly the same, right? They are inferring, a depth to this character if you can sort of evoke it out of them. The other thing I wanted to say is when it comes to NPCs, one of the things I found most shocking when I started running campaigns is, oh God, I have to remember some of these NPCs, which was, I'd run a lot of one-shots. And so I was just free to sort of, birth new NPCs, make them ridiculous, and move on with my life and never remember a thing. So I think just to reiterate some of the things we talked about with NPCs, if you wrote down a name, like a physical characteristic or some aspect about their fashion, maybe that you established, basically a unique thing that you told your players about them, a catchphrase and a motivation, I think you're totally I think that can be a really pretty rock solid NPC going forward. So if you make someone who you can tell has somehow gotten woven into this plot in a bigger way than you intended, jotting those things down, or at least a subset of them, can really help cement it for future sessions.
Yeah. I think that's really smart. I think that lots of people, when they think about running a game, they think about making a lot of notes ahead of time, and that's great. You can do a lot of preparation if you want to, but also expect to take a bunch of notes after the session is over.
Yes.
Because you're going to make some stuff up on the fly. The players are going to encounter a thing, and you're going to want to remember it. I think that's really smart.
Yeah. One other thing I wanted to call out was in the bestiaries for Cypher system and things, each creature, you called creatures NPCs, which I kind of separate in my mind a lot, but you're totally right. A lot of the same issues apply when you're talking about, interesting monsters or beasts, they're creatures they might meet.
Right.
Each creature entry has a motivation, and man, does that help you role play it and make interesting scenarios at the table. So I think always keeping motivation at the heart of the NPCs you build will feed forward into your story really well. So can't recommend that enough.
Yeah. Let's focus on that a little bit more, because you're right. Creatures are an interesting subset of NPCs, but I think you can take all these same lessons and apply them, right?
Yeah.
This monster might have, big, horrible teeth and lasers that shoot out of its eyes, but that's not its goal. Its goal isn't to shoot lasers out of its eyes, right? Its goal is protecting its young, or defending its lair, or, getting something to eat.
Yeah.
And if you think about that, it stops just being a bunch of numbers in a book or on a page, and it becomes a thing, right? So that if it'll start to act more like a real creature, right? If it's there, and it's hungry and it wants a meal, but the players are doing a bunch of damage to it, it's going to run away, right? It doesn't want to die. It's hungry. It's stupid.
That's such a good point. So we've talked a little bit about different categories of NPCs and the different ways you want to handle them. But even beyond sort of, if you think about ongoing NPCs, there's still the featured, top billing, big bad, or, big helpful person. And so often I, as a GM, am trying to root for the players. And so it's actually pretty hard work for me to go, okay, who is this antagonist, and what problems are they going to present, and sort of why? That work feels really different to me than sort of the other NPC making. And I find it hard, and sort of a lot of sitting down and thinking and question asking.
Yeah, I think that, again, starting with what they want, and then how are they going to get it? And we're going to get into this even more, I think, when we start talking about advanced jamming. Give you guys a little secret. Figure out how smart you think the main antagonist really is. Because the way to portray a really smart antagonist is to cheat. And what I mean by that is, you're there at the table and you know what the players are doing. And if your villain is really, really smart, if she's super genius, godlike intelligence or whatever, right? She's Sherlock Holmes level intelligence. she's going to know what they're going to do before they even do it.
Ah,
And
that's so
so
smart.
having that person show up where they weren't expected because she already figured out that that's what they were going to do, that some people would look at that as cheating, right? But what it's actually doing is it's portraying this person in this world in an accurate way.
Yeah.
The same way that it's totally fair that a dragon can breathe fire, it's totally fair that a really, really smart villain can know some of this stuff ahead of time. You just have to use that trick really sparingly, right? Because if you've got someone who's not super smart, then don't do that, right? Have them caught off guard. If the players have some, great plan, they're going to sneak into their, headquarters or whatever, have them totally caught off guard, right? Because now you're thinking less about, how do I make this a role-playing game encounter, and you're more role-playing this NPC, right? And this NPC is not very bright, and he didn't know the players were going to do the things that they were going to do, right? So remember that as the game master, you're playing the game too, right? And so in the same way that we expect players to role play their characters, you're expected to role play the NPCs.
That's a really good point. Something I haven't taken advantage of as much as I would like to. So like kind of an aspect of jamming that I'm interested in. Maybe we can talk more about in the advanced jamming, but it's about mistakes that NPCs make. And I think when I imagine like a really effective like cool antagonist that is going to really challenge the players, to some extent, like even really smart people make mistakes. And so incorporating that into play is something that I haven't really messed around with quite yet. I mostly kind of try to beat the players and know that they're going to get really creative and weird and put all their heads together and often succeed against me is sort of how I approach it. But
there are sort of metagame traps that I think players fall into. And for example, one of them is, the NPC said this. So, and of course that was the GM saying it. So it must be right.
Yeah.
Right. But no, the NPCs can be wrong, right? If the NPC says, I think they went that way, that doesn't mean that they actually did go that way. They might have just made a mistake. And I think that the more you can kind of shake your players out of that, or never sort of even allow them to fall into that trap in the first place, kind of the more verisimilitude you're going to give your world.
Yeah. We trust that person.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that, or maybe they just made a legit mistake, right? Or maybe the person that they thought went that way was so clever, right, that they fooled even the NPC, right? And now you're saying something about two NPCs, right? The other trap that is very similar to that is, and I've seen this happen so many times, is that the idea that every NPC is ultimately not trustworthy, right? And right, you encounter somebody and they're up to something, right? And so I have found through personal experience that interjecting really, really nice, kind, generous people as NPCs now and again into the campaign, not only kind of shakes things up, right? But it is such a great tool. And here's why, right? Like literally just this week, I ran a game where the players, there's a bad guy, they've been chasing him for a really long time. They have so many reasons to hate him. They want to like basically corner him and get him, right?
Yeah. And
the person who I didn't want them, I wanted there to be one more hurdle to do that. And the hurdle was that they couldn't, he lived in this big tower, and I didn't want them to be able to just corner him there. I wanted them one more hurdle, right? Now, I could have had someone in the tower be like, no, you can't do that. And if you try to attack anyone in my tower, you'll get my vengeance and blah, 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 right?
Yeah.
But I didn't do that. I had the person who was kind of the caretaker of this tower where this guy lived was super sweet, super nice. Right? And he just made it really clear, I hope you don't cause any trouble while you're here. Right. And that was so much more effective than threats of violence or whatever. right? Because everyone was like, oh, well, this guy's so nice and he's giving us free dinner and laughed at our jokes.
He happens to be a Dagon cultist, but he's just so sweet,
So, mixing it up, right?
Yeah.
Don't let all your NPCs be the same. Maybe that's the best takeaway from this. Mix it up. Have good people, bad people,
I definitely, one of the most powerful tips that I got or sort of discovered when I first started jamming is sort of think about your NPCs after, just like taking those notes, right? I found out about all my ruts that way, right? Like, for some reason I only came up with male NPCs in this whole session. We encountered a lot of people, and they're all named Joe or whatever, right? So I think you're totally right. Like, reflect on what your patterns have been and see what you can shake up. I think it'll take you a long way.
I agree wholeheartedly. And one way that you can do that is, so don't be afraid to start with a cliche, right? If you're running a fantasy game, you've got the haughty elf who likes poetry and fine food, right? That's fine. Do that, right? But then make sure that the next prominent NPC elf goes against the stereotype, right? Slovenly and drunk, right? Or whatever, right? And now you already know that you've got variation, right? Totally. And so it's too much of a hurdle, particularly for a beginning GM, to try to avoid the cliches. Totally. And the cliches are there for a reason.
They're useful.
Right. But then the next step is then diverge, right?
We've been talking so far about pacing, and we've talked about information and people. And in a previous episode, we've established that adventures are a little bit bullshit. However, I think we should talk a little bit about adventure types and sort of what goes on, what kinds of things are happening. And so one thing that is well known as a staple of RPG experiences is combat, right? There's a bad thing and I'm going to beat it up and maybe I'm taking its gold. Right. And I think there's lots of great advice you can find out about combat. And there's, I suspect, advice in here about combat too. It feeds into all the things we've been talking about. But I think sometimes when GMs who have mostly run combat or who are sort of prepared, the rules have prepared them for combat. Once it gets into, okay, we're having a scene and the players really want to role play with this, this butler or whatever, right? It feels a little less on the rails of, well, there's no turn order,
Right.
When you get into things that other than combat, sometimes there can be a little bit of a learning curve, or, there's sort of a different suite of best practices maybe that you might want to consider.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Most games are great at telling you how to run a combat, and we don't even probably need to get into that here, right?
Right.
We're good at that. But what do you do other than combat? And I really encourage you to venture forth beyond just fight. That's fun. Fighting can be fun. And we like it because it's the way to sort of match up my character with a direct, obvious challenge, and there's interesting ways that they interact with, because the game, has all these different little subsystems of, hit points or whatever. But then, right, what do you do when they want to just talk to someone, and how do you make that interesting? And, in a way, it kind of goes back to the NPC stuff that we were talking about, right? If you make some interesting NPCs, then your interaction encounters that you have with NPCs, is going to be interesting, particularly if you're focusing on what the NPC wants, and it's not exactly what the players want, right? It doesn't have to be diametrically opposed, but if it's just a little off, right, then there's some conflict, there's some tension, and the NPC is going to be resistant, and they're going to say, no, I don't want you to let you through here, because I want that treasure for myself, or whatever. And I think that's a really good foundation for a non-combat interaction encounter. But Darcy, do you like encounters where there just aren't like an interaction encounter is in a way a combat encounter, right?
There's an
Because
obvious, opponent or challenge
right.
set in front of your character. Yeah.
Do you like encounters that don't have either of those things?
So I was thinking about like exploration things, but
Right.
I think that, the thing that came to mind was like, I'm Frodo on the mountain and the mountain sucks and it's about to throw me off. And so to some extent, like that sort of, it's me versus the environment. That's still kind of a versus. So it's that's, the way you make it interesting, I think there's still, you give kind of the environment a personality, right? The wind is bearing down on you, and you can kind of get into what that challenge is. So I'm trying to think like, but maybe more like, I think something weird is going on in this house and I'm trying to figure out what it is. That's a little more less direct. So that might
Right.
fall into kind of a more different category.
True. True. Both very viable though.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things that you can do if you want to start exploring some of this stuff, no pun intended, is take the idea that we just said, right, that the game maybe doesn't give you as many hard and fast rule systems for these kinds of non-combat encounters, and see that as a feature and not a bug. And here's what I mean by that. So you've got a character and they're climbing a horrible cliff, and they've got to scale this mountain and get up to the top for some reason, and it's cold and windy and whatnot. Since there aren't rules in your game probably for this, right? You're totally in your it's your purview to say, well, you're climbing and your boot gets caught between two rocks and gets torn off and it falls down the mountainside. Now you don't have a left boot, right? And so how are you going to deal with that, right?
Yep.
How are you going to overcome that? I mean, like that sounds like a silly thing, right? But that suddenly makes this, it's not just, okay, I make my climb roll, end of encounter.
It's about stakes, right? You're totally right. Combat has obvious stakes. I'm trying to wheedle this information out of the merchant, and if I don't get it, whatever the stakes of the big bad are, or the big situation, I think I'm trying to get up this mountain. You might just be, it might be easy to not see the stakes of that, but you can reinforce sort of the danger or the excitement with a little bit of this narrative input. So a convenient aspect of combat is that there are turns often, and often like the big, bad, scary anglerfish has a turn, and on that turn, I'm the anglerfish and I'm going to mess with the PCs, right?
Right.
When we're just narrating a mountain or something, I sometimes especially when I first started GMing, it was hard for me to remember to like interject interesting complications and pepper them throughout, right? The thing that helped me was GM intrusions, right? It is a staple of Cypher system that you're supposed to, and you have the GM has a mechanical button that is distributing XP to bribe players into taking interesting complications on. And so it just reminds me that that's actually a feature, not a bug too, right? Is that although you've taken the player's left boot, you might feel bad like you're screwing over the player. That you've made things way more interesting. That is a gift to your player, right? That is a gift to make their eventual ascent feel all that much sweeter because you've challenged them a bit. So I think that was a hard thing for me to learn, especially as a GM. I was such a fan of the players. I was afraid to ever do anything too interesting and complicated, but pepper those complications into any kind of scene, right?
I think that certainly a trap that I fell into in that regard was early on was the idea that thinking that everything had to have a basis in the mechanics of the game.
Great point.
So if it wasn't doing hit point damage, if it wasn't giving you a -2 on your rolls or whatever, then it wasn't a real obstacle.
Right.
But what I learned, of course, is that just as though we can. you can have lots of narrative things happen in your game. You can have narrative obstacles, right? That is literally, you just lost your boot.
Yeah.
And now you don't have a boot. And that there's no game mechanic necessarily tied to that, but you're going to see the player take that and kind of run with it and, talk about how, well, okay, I take something out of my pack and I wrap it around my foot and, they're solving this problem that isn't, numbers, right? It isn't numbers on your character sheet. And suddenly
yes.
You start to venture into making this a story as well as a game, right?
And I think that illustrates one of the powers of like RPGs over playing a really immersive narrative, like video game RPG, right? Is that like that being able to grapple with things that exist outside of mechanics and like is just such a powerful, beautiful moment for RPGs. I think about them as like MacGyver moments, right? Like, oh, you've got a weird river and like, I don't know how the players are going to get across. I don't know what's around. Are they going to raft it? Are they going to swim? Are they going to, come up with this weird idea to get around this, narrative complication, basically.
I think
my favorites.
Yeah, I think that overall, right, the lesson to learn here is just in the same way that when someone is learning what an RPG is for the very first time, right, and you kind of see their mind get blown as they're like, I can do anything. I think that GMs have to have the same realization. I can have anything happen, right?
Yeah.
I can do these things. I don't have to look it up in the rule book somewhere. I don't, right? It just, you are guiding the story, and your goal, just like all the players' goals, should be to have the coolest, best, most fun story experience that you can have, right? And working with the players, you're creating a fun story, and don't worry about the rules that much, right? And if there isn't a rule for something, then that's an opportunity, and that's not a problem.
Yeah, that's a great point. When I so that kind of power is super addicting and super creative and fun, and I love it dearly, and that's why I love GMing to absolute bits. But the I can do anything means that I'm going to be doing, as a GM, I'm going to be doing things that are new to me all the time, right? Like, I love shaking things up, but it means that I'm probably venturing into territory that I haven't done before, and so sometimes I can be a little I can feel a little nervous about that. And so, if it's, whether it's I'm trying to have a different scene or trying to play in a genre and experiment with, I don't know, like thriller, like a thriller episode, especially when you're thinking about an episode. And so one of the things that helped me the most, and that I still do when I'm exploring something that I don't feel like I've done a lot at the table yet, is to go like watch some TV. So I'm going to run a space game and I kind of want it to be, space exploration. I'll go like watch some episodes of Star Trek and I'll note, what things that I think I can use. And there's going to be plenty that doesn't work like that. Right. These are different mediums, but it doesn't mean you can't take inspiration from lots of other places.
Yeah, I agree. We talked about a little bit in the world building episode where, don't feel that you have to be George R. R. Martin or whatever, right? No one's expecting that of you. Your players aren't expecting that. And that it's kind of like this, right? Like, if you're running a space opera game, interject something that's just straight out of Star Wars, and your players aren't going to think less of you. They're going to think, oh, cool, this is just like that thing that happened in Empire Strikes Back, right? And everyone will be fine with it, right? There is no plagiarism when it comes to running games, right? Like, if you're going to publish this stuff, that's a totally different thing. But if it's just you and your friends around the table, take inspiration from books and movies and anything that you can get your hands on.
Prog rock songs. Are adventures written for you, right? Just take from them. Cool places.
It's true. Listen to some old Rush and we'll have all the adventures, whole campaigns, really.
What about taking inspiration from like nonfiction sources? Where do you what's the interaction?
You're a great example of that. As a scientist, I know for a fact you take inspiration from the things that you've studied?
Yeah, I mean, the ocean is full of things stranger than fiction, I think.
Mhm.
And so that's always been very fun. So like, yeah, I'm a scientist. I love taking in weird creatures and just tossing them into my game. Sometimes adjusting them a little bit, sometimes leaving them as the weird fantasy creatures that they are at heart. And it's always a fun reveal when you get to say, oh, that thing you battled that, had all that mucus and it's spewing its guts out at you and then, taking them back in. Like, that was a sea cucumber. Here's one. Aren't they horrible? Don't you love them? So I love that. Nonfiction can also be good for like interesting places, like getting beautiful imagery of like a jungle I've never been to or some location that, I can't be at in person, but when I'm trying to describe this really rich kind of desert locale, going into stories set in those places and documentaries, right, are great to just put on and immerse yourself in.
Just flip open Wikipedia, right? If you're going to have a adventure set in the jungle, read about a little about what it's like to be in the jungle. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really smart. You can also, as weird as it would seem, like you can like go to today's news, right? And if you're looking for a story idea, if you're looking for
Yeah,
a plot, it's real life, I guess, in a way of speaking, is full of them. It's full of
mm-hmm.
stories and plots and whatnot, and there'll probably be things that you wouldn't have thought of on your own,
Totally.
whether it's some bank heist or some political thing or whatever. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and real life, your own real life.
Totally.
If you've got if you've got a job where your boss is a big jerk and he's always coming down on you and he's saying these things that are demeaning or whatever, use it, right? Put it
Yeah.
in the game. Have a some tyrant overlord using saying those exact same things, right?
Yeah.
And then the players will beat the crap out of them and you'll feel better.
Absolutely. Um, the thing about news is really interesting. I haven't ever tried that yet, but I love the idea because news headlines are trying to distill a story into like a convenient little nugget when we know life is messy, but like news articles or coverage like that is trying to find the story, the tighter like hook of a story from kind of messy real life. And so like they've done the work of boiling down the good little story bit to take. I think it's really smart. And like also the fact that, whether drawing from life or nonfiction or fiction, I guess, like people talk differently, and I think that's when I
Right.
when I when I read someone's interesting voice or dialogue, or I'm going on a road trip and I get to hear some people speaking in kind of a dialect or a cadence that I've never heard before. Oh my gosh, that's just take that to the RPG bank. You could cash that for good, delicious NPC use later, right? And it's something that I wouldn't have thought of on my own. It's always so specific and full of life that you just want to take that.
And I guess I would say also, don't be afraid to bring some of this stuff right to the table with you.
Mm,
Like if you can prepare your session, you can prepare your adventure as much as you want. There's still going to be things that are going to come up in the game where you're going to need some instant inspiration right
mhm,
there at the table. And so, we kind of mentioned it before, having a comic book, right? I've done things like, when I was running a sort of a kind of straightforward science fiction game, I created a Pinterest page that was just
mm,
filled with cool sci-fi art. And if I needed inspiration, I clicked that open, saw the cool space station, and suddenly that space station was there in orbit around the planet that they were.
yeah.
And whatever inspires you, what
Hmm.
tarot deck, whatever you think will sort of jog a cool idea, because it's a bad spot to be in when you're just caught there with a deer in the headlights look and you're like, I don't know what's going to happen next.
Oh yeah, I hate that spinning my wheels feeling. Um, so I love having things there to inspire me. Um, they help for prep and they're useful for like, I could look at that Pinterest board when I'm preparing for a session, and it's helpful to me at the table. So things like that I think are really valuable and fun. They've also, I just find them, I feel like I've become a little like inspiration magpie, right? Like now I kind of can't, sometimes I can't turn my GM brain off, and I'm like, ooh, this weird book of like, 1600s woodcuts from Japan is like I could just have this book, and I'm like, I don't know what I'm gonna use it for, but like, wouldn't that be inspiring at the table? Aren't I curious what flipping to a page will sort of bring out of me at the table? I collect weird rocks now. Like, because I love having them. I love being able to set certain things out at the table to help inspire the players too and bring them in. One thing I did with we talk about GM as player a lot in your best game ever, and I think it's relevant to so many aspects of RPGdom. But one of the things is, for those players too, sometimes they can get stuck in a rut, right? You ask them what their fear is, and they're like, oh, I don't know. Hand them a tarot deck, right? Hand them a comic book and say, does any, if they need inspiration too, I think that's a useful tool for anybody.
Yeah. I think encouraging everyone around the table to, use what they know, right? Don't be afraid to pull something out of Lord of the Rings if Lord of the Rings is your thing, right? There's nothing wrong with that. I think we've somehow kind of gotten this idea that there is, but when I started playing Dungeons and Dragons at 11 years old, my Dungeons and Dragons game had lightsabers and, it was from everything, right? And ripped everything off.
Oh my gosh.
We could probably talk about game mastering for like 3 more hours, but we should, and I will say that like we've just barely touched on what's covered in your best game ever, and what it means to be a GM, but I think we kind of at least gave a few good tips. Hopefully will be of use to people in their games. Darcy, where can we go to find out like how to get a copy of this book?
Absolutely. You can go to yourbestgameever.com, and there should be a little URL below us that you can go to, and you can get Your Best Game Ever, and you can also get, I have to plug, these really cool player and GM notebooks that came out as a part of this that are, system agnostic. And as we talked about a lot of these tips, the GM notebook has a lot of cool sections that sort of spark you to use some of the advice that we talked about here, right? Places for NPCs and some little details about like a quirk they have, or places for you to write down quotes as players too, right? What are some cool things my player, my character has done? What are some NPCs they care about? What are some characteristics of them? So both of those are now available for sale, and you can go get them at yourbestgameever.com.
Cool. Well, awesome. Thank you. And don't forget, we're going to do sort of more advanced GMing next time. So we'll talk about all this stuff again, but we'll amp it up.
Yeah, next level. Bye, everybody.
Bye.